Hi, this is Leonel Castillo. I'm with the Small Farm Outreach Program, and I would just like to say that I am very happy to be working with For the Soil, and I am all for soil conservation and hope that everybody follows our podcast. Thank you.
What a pleasure it is to welcome you to the second season of For the Soil, a conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii. That's right, this is season 2, episode number 2, but overall, this is episode number 29 of our podcast called For the Soil, a conversation. We want to thank our supporters for the first year of this podcast. It's been steadily growing, and we sincerely appreciate all the listeners who have tuned in on a regular basis and all the support we've been getting from, the list would be long if I started down that list, but we've been getting a lot of support from a lot of people about a very important topic, and that is about topsoil and the importance that we have healthy topsoil. Our guest today and our topic today will be talking about appropriate technology. The key word, appropriate technology. Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition and Eric Benfelt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability will be joining me for this podcast. Let's get right to it. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of For the Soil, a conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and joining us, Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And Mary, I know we have a really special guest for this episode. Would you do the honor of introducing our guest?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so excited to have Lee Rinehart with us today. He is a sustainable agriculture specialist in the National Center for Appropriate Technologies Northeast Regional Office, where he focuses on pasture and rangeland ecology and grazing systems. Graduate of Texas A&M University, where he studied animal science and agricultural education. Served as a county extension agent in Texas and Montana, organic farm educator in Pennsylvania, cattle ranch manager in Central Texas. So really all over the board of sustainable agriculture. So excited to have Lee with us today to share some of his experience and perspectives, as well as a little bit about a project he is working on actually with For the Soil that's at the intersection of soil and water in Virginia. So to start, Lee, would love to hear a little bit more about your background, how you got into agriculture, and what the National Center for Appropriate Technology does, because that name leaves some questions in my head.
Very good. Well, thanks a lot, Mary, for asking me to come aboard, and thanks, Jeff, for helping to organize the audio and everything. I really appreciate talking for a while. So I came to agriculture because of long ago because of my grandpa, right, on both sides of my family. My grandpa was a farmer in East Texas, and my great grandpa on my dad's side was a Brahmin ranch manager on the Texas Gulf Coast. So I come to agriculture pretty honestly, right? Went to Texas A&M, bounced around all over. One of the things is I know that having experience in agriculture in South Texas and Montana and Pennsylvania, it has really kind of helped me to understand the different regions and the different ecotypes and the different kinds of grasses and crops and practices and such. So, so I finally wound up in northeastern Pennsylvania, working with not PASA, but PCO. They used to be Pennsylvania Certified Organic, and then they just changed their name to PCO. So they're the certifier there, and I worked with them for a while, and then came back to NCAT, National Center for Appropriate Technology, where I serve as a sustainable agriculture specialist. I get to talk to farmers and ranchers all over the country about their production practices and give them ideas and learn from them and get their ideas and share them with other people, particularly with pasture and rangeland management systems. So that's kind of what keeps me busy during the day.
Lee, we were talking before the podcast today about trends we're seeing in agriculture with sustainable ag. We've got a whole new set of terminology in agriculture with regenerative agriculture. We're seeing more homesteading going on. People want to learn more about self-sufficiency. What are you seeing in that regard?
Oh yeah, I'm seeing pretty much the same thing. I'm seeing a lot more people whom you probably wouldn't see become interested in what we're calling sustainable agriculture, especially because of increased fuel and fertilizer prices lately. I mean, they've gone through the roof, almost tripled for putting down nitrogen on an acre of ground, right? So I've seen people become very interested in what can I do to decrease my fuel and fertilizer bill by implementing some soil management practices that might help to offset that fertilizer cost. And namely, I'm talking about things like cover cropping and diverse plantings and rotations and such. So that's a big trend that I have seen. And well, I mean, we were talking earlier, it's like I see home gardeners and subsistence gardens coming up a lot more now. We've got a lot of interest in Pennsylvania where I am about doing some outreach and some programming to help people to build their soils in their subsistence gardens and home gardens, and even vegetable production for for retail as well. There's a lot of interest in soil management practices from the 1,000 square foot garden all the way up to the 2,000 foot soybean field.
And Lee, I know your specialty and your focus is really on the pasture management, integration of livestock side. And, as we talk about soil health, we, for the soil, focus on the 4 core principles, but really see integrating livestock as going across all 4 of those principles as key to all aspects of building soil health if done sustainably and regeneratively. So, I wonder if you could share some about your understanding of where integrating livestock plays into the system of building soil health.
Yeah, so I look at livestock as an organism that co-evolved with the native grasslands across the world, right? So in other words, the animal evolved alongside the grasses and the forbs and such that came up and became established on our steppes and grasslands all across the world. The animal grazes in a herd. I mean, these large ruminants are herd animals, and we've heard much about the bison and how they would park themselves on a piece of land in the West for a couple of days, and they would eat and they would move on, and they wouldn't come back to that piece of land for maybe another year or certainly another season, and it would get lots of rest. So they would be depositing an awful lot of carbon material within their feces and urine, and they would be fertilizing that soil and clipping it and keeping that succession in that perennial grassland stage, right? So it's this symbiotic relationship between the land and the animal. And whenever we're talking about our crops, if we did one of the worst things we could ever do back in the mid 1800s, where we started using guano and we started using Chilean nitrate. And this is before synthetic fertilizers. And we started mining those and bringing those into the country and using those on our land. And with all of that nitrogen fertility, we did not need the manure in the animals anymore. We were able to ramp up to monoculture production. And with the advent of that, we had surpluses. And then all of a sudden we have the cycle going. We're producing. And that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in agriculture. But it came about by having animals disassociated from the land. And whenever we did that, we had lots of nitrogen that we could put on the soil, but we disassociated the carbon cycle. And what you saw was rapid decreases in soil quality and loss of soil through erosion over the years. And then whenever we got synthetic nitrogen due to the Haber-Bosch process after the war, it just accelerated things. It accelerated that soil degradation. And so I would say that really kind of started with this whole idea of taking animals off the land and specializing that land for particular monoculture crop production. But we are seeing now that whenever we take livestock and put them back on the land and we integrate them within cropping systems, within pastures, within grazing cover crops, grazing cash crop residue and stubble, we're returning that animal that provides so much of that carbon, that necessary carbon input into the system, right? That our soils are starting to regenerate again. So animals and livestock, livestock and crops and pasture really, really need to go together.
We're talking today with Lee Rinehart, a sustainable agriculture specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. And Lee, I'm intrigued by the name of your organization. What do you consider appropriate technology, or maybe even another way to ask that? What's inappropriate?
A lot of the stuff that we're doing now is pretty inappropriate. I mean, if we disassociate the carbon cycle from agriculture, that's inappropriate, right? We want to have carbon, nitrogen in sync, and providing that biological material within the soils to give the microorganisms food where they can actually feed the plants themselves. But appropriate technology comes from way back from E.F. Schumacher. Small is beautiful. You might remember the name of the book. And Schumacher, he basically advocated for an appropriate technology, and what he meant there was ways of doing things that are locally adapted, place-based, simple, and they are human scaled with respect to what the family or the community can pull together and can do, and also what they can share with their neighbors. Because for Schumacher and for appropriate technology advocates, it wasn't just producing food from the land in an appropriate way. It was who's producing that land, and what are the social implications of the people who are on that land using this technology? How is it making their lives richer and more fulfilled and better, right? So a lot of people would say, well, that's kind of just going back, small is beautiful, and appropriate technology is just going back in time. But it's not. It's just using our brains, using the technology and the know-how that we have right now with plant breeding, soil science, internet technology, all of these things, and making it locally adapted to the place where we live. And so, I mean, the types of systems that we might do in Pennsylvania is going to be completely different than what we're going to implement in Arizona, right? And then not only ecologically, but sociologically too. Some people are going to need and want certain types of systems. An indigenous society in New Mexico is going to want to have their cropping system designed in a very different way than somebody in Iowa. Right. So appropriate technology is basically place-based, people-centered.
Lee, also with regenerative agriculture, and also we're seeing a high nitrogen fertilizer cost. And I know many growers and producers talk about, are we doing all to optimize nitrogen fixation out of the atmosphere with legumes and diversification? Could you speak to that?
Well, yeah. And there's so much nitrogen up above the ground, right? All the nitrogen we'll ever need to produce food for the rest of the life of the universe is up above the grass. We just have to get it down, right? Fortunately, we do have those organisms. We have, of course, the rhizobia bacteria that associate with legumes that do convert that N2 to a plant available form of nitrogen that the plant can take up. But we have free living nitrogen fixing bacteria and other organisms within the ground that will do the same thing, and which is why we have been advocating for diversity. Sometimes, soil management, soil health advocates can get kind of repetitious. It's like, we want diversity. Well, that's why, right? We want lots of different types of plants along the landscape within a cropping system to provide various species of various families within the soil profile, because we know that the more diverse plant species we have, the more diverse microorganisms we're going to have associated with those plants underneath the soil. And so one of our key principles is diversity on landscapes. And one of the benefits that it does is it provides more microorganisms, more nitrogen fixation, more nutrient cycling, right? Till we can get to the point where we can reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilization. Some people can get rid of it completely, but that's one of those things that takes an awful lot of time, and you have to wean yourself off of that. You don't just go whole hog, but we can build soils through diversity to actually take up a large part of that fertilizer bill.
And Lee, a project that you are very involved in, as well as Eric and myself, is this Soil for Water. And we've talked about the benefits of building soil health and the role of integrating livestock. And I know that has a large grazing component in it. Wondering if you could just tell a little background about the project in its goals.
Yeah, so this project started back in 2015. If people can remember, kind of take your focus and put it down southwest, Texas was boiling. I mean, they were experiencing a really bad drought that they're really still in right now. I was in Texas in May, and I was on a farm that had not had but 2 inches since November of 21, and that was insane, right? So he was having to irrigate, drip irrigation and such on the vegetable farm. But back in 2015, the drought really hit hard, and there was a lot of destocking. And so a lot of actors came together and said, well, what can we do, especially within the central part of Texas, what they call the hill country? It's a semi-annual, a semi-arid type of rainfall of 15 to 20 inches of rainfall per year, right? Sometimes they're only getting 5 inches of rainfall a year. But we want to say, how can we develop regenerative soil management systems that would just allow us to capture every bit of rainwater that we got? And we can do that, and we know that we can by using regenerative grazing practices that allow for more carbon to be put into the soil to act as a soil sponge. You can hold that water, and plants in a grazing situation can last for an awful lot longer through a dry spell if they have a lot of soil cover, if they have not been overgrazed, and if you've got really good organic matter in the soil holding that water in, keeping the temperature down. Well, you can actually carry over your grazing through hard times without having to destock as much as if you didn't do that. So that's kind of where we started. And then we said, well, you know what, if this works here, it's got to work everywhere else too, because everywhere there's agriculture and soil. So we brought Soil for Water through an NRCS grant, through a Southern SARE grant, to California and Colorado, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Virginia. And I am really pleased to be able to be working with Eric and Mary for the Virginia project. We also have Brent Wills, who is the president of the Virginia Association for Biological Farming, as another partner for the Virginia work. And so we're looking at Virginia and saying, how can we help producers and other organizations who are already doing wonderful work in there kind of come together and help to increase the adoption of sustainable and regenerative soil management practices. And in Virginia, the way I look at it is not so much for drought, although we have our drought times. It's more, how do I capture and keep all of that water that comes so that it doesn't go into the bay, and that so I can maintain productivity all the way through the summer.
We're going to go ahead and jump in here and let you know we're going to bring Lee Rinehart back to continue this conversation about appropriate technology and soil health. I hope you'll come back for part 2 of this episode. For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of Jackson F. Smith and Mr. Ruiz. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.